Senator Cruz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Moran. Dr. Mulvanon, let's start with you. You state in your testimony that, quote, the United States is currently in a deep deterrence hole with respect to China. Based on what you know about Salt Typhoon, as well as your extended knowledge of other state-based attacks on U.S. networks more broadly, is the problem we're facing one of insufficient regulation of domestic companies, or are there broader issues at play?
I really do believe, Senator, that it has to do with the strategic dynamic between Washington and Beijing, and that the carriers are really collateral damage in the discussion. It really has to do with a basic breakdown of deterrence stability that we have with the Chinese on a whole range of strategic topics, including space, nuclear weapons, and cyber. And it really has to do with the issue that the Chinese, at least in cyber, don't actually believe that they found our pain point yet because they haven't elicited a response from us that would suggest that they found our pain point.
So what would provide meaningful deterrence?
Well, meaningful deterrence can really only be achieved through imposing costs rather than simply building better defenses, which, as I've tried to point out, is more difficult. To Senator Lujan's comment, however, I would say that the most powerful weapon in the U.S. government's arsenal is not the Trident D5 nuclear missile on the Ohio-class submarine. It's actually the federal acquisition regulations. Because to the extent to which the federal acquisition regulations combined with better NIST standards for telecom security, the U.S. government is one of the largest consumers of telecommunications equipment in the United States. And through the federal acquisition regulation, could simply raise the floor on the cybersecurity quality of the hardware going into the infrastructure.
So should the federal government do that, and what precisely would that look like?
It has been going on for the last couple of years, but going on very slowly. NIST has been very slowly raising the standard, and I would only highlight as a defense contractor that the defense industrial base is held to a much higher standard than non-defense contractors in the United States. And we actually have to adhere to a much higher level of cybersecurity standard for our networks. And the way that the U.S. government, in fact, enforces that higher level of standard is through the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. In other words, if we want to stay in business, we've got to fix the cybersecurity. But in terms of our dynamic with Beijing, that is really beyond the purview of the companies for the same reason you said in your opening statement, which is no commercial company is able to withstand the dedicated activity of a state cyber actor. And thus, really, cyber deterrence comes down to a response policy by Cyber Command and the other elements of the U.S. government in terms of imposing costs on the Chinese side such that it changes their calculus of the expected value of future attacks and intrusions.
So, Dr. Lewis, you state in your testimony that countering China requires, quote, a sustained, direct, and more forceful effort to disincentivize the Chinese. In your judgment, what can a future Trump administration do to curb the incentives of the Chinese to engage in these types of deeply troubling behaviors?
Thank you, Senator. I'm hopeful that the incoming administration will do this, but you need a two-part strategy. First, you need to engage with the Chinese regularly, the way we had arms control talks with the Soviets on nuclear weapons. You need to start by telling the Chinese, this is unacceptable, you've gone too far, and if you don't stop, we're going to take action. Now, they aren't going to stop, right? That's just, why would they believe us? So the next step is to actually do something, and this would be where Cyber Command or NSA probably needs to develop a menu of responses, not the top end, but something a little lower down, probably going after their attack infrastructure in cyberspace, and then go back to the Chinese and say, we weren't kidding, now do you want to talk? The Chinese aren't that interested in making a deal with us. I was there in September, and they basically said, you're on a downhill path, why should we deal with you now? So I think the first step is to engage, warn them, and then take action.
Dr. Mulvanon, you also state in your testimony that the FCC's recent announcement of plans to require communication providers to submit certification that they have implemented a cybersecurity risk management plan is, quote, not nearly proactive enough. Are you concerned that the FCC might be so focused on doing something that it risks creating policies that merely appear effective without addressing the core of the problem?
Well, to be fair, it could have been worse. They could have called for a blue ribbon commission. But the FCC has direct regulatory oversight, particularly over CALIA compliance. And in the past, when CALIA was expanded to include broadband and VoIP, those were led by orders from FCC. So what I expected to see in their press release was a specific discussion of CALIA compliance and wiretapping compliance and certification from the carriers that they were engaged in fixing the problem right now. Not some airy-fairy sort of annual certification, but that they were actually going to submit something within 90 days that actually described how they were going to actually remediate the specific vulnerability that caused Salt Typhoon in the first place. And I was surprised to not see it.
So a final question to anyone on the panel who wishes to answer it. What should the American people know about Salt Typhoon, about what happened, and about the security of their communications?
Senator, I'll share that American people should know that our communications network has been attacked. That the carriers are doing their best to provide service. There are things that consumers can do. RCS, rich communication services for text messages, is encrypted end to end. If you use those services, then there's ways that even if somebody is watching the network, they cannot see what the traffic is. There are steps that consumers can also take to increase their security, and our carriers are trying to work to educate them on those while we're also working to kick the attackers out of the networks.
Thank you, Senator. I guess the first thing I'd say is that they should know that we're losing, right? So we're not on the winning side of the scoreboard here in the telecommunications and cyber espionage battle. The second thing they need to know is their services that they depend on, whether it's delivery from a company or the phone or the electricity, are all at risk and are all potentially being held hostage by a hostile foreign power. That makes me nervous.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cruz.